Chapter 3 The Wesleyan Helper. That part of the life and ministry of Francis Asbury, which fell to him in England, furnishes a vantage for studying the character, equipment, and work of the early Methodist preacher. Certainly, the whole history of the Wesleyan revival affords no better illustration of the discipleship which, through the Spirit and under the leadership of a fellow of Lincoln College, brought its wonders to pass. The early Methodist preacher was not as the Methodist preacher of today, though happily the likeness in spiritual simplicity and zeal, as still too much an exception, is not wholly wanting in the modern itinerant, nor is he entirely a stranger to the early rule of life and service. With rare exceptions, the early Methodist preacher was a layman, and that without hope of graduating through a quadrennial course of study in the clerical orders. His sole ecclesiastical authority was a license for Mr. Wesley to preach in the chapels which he held for the use of the people, called Methodists. Generally, too, this preacher was a man of little culture, who had come out of social obscurity, and the evidence of whose call was to be found in his own testimony, zeal, and success. The early Methodist preachers, as regarded their relations to Mr. Wesley and the work, were divided into two classes, namely assistants and helpers. The assistants were the preachers in charge of circuits, while the helpers were those preachers itinerant or local, who served under the assistants. The significance of the title assistant was in the direct relation which the bearer of it sustained to Mr. Wesley, who regarded himself as officially present in each of the circuits, and therefore the man actually in charge of it was only his assistant. The assistants were expected to meet with him in the yearly conferences, but it was not obligatory upon the helpers to do so. The letters or license which Wesley gave to his preachers were meant to preserve decency and order and secure his authority over the assistants and helpers, and through them over the societies. No ecclesiastical significance attached to these letters. The Methodist societies were not churches. Their members were supposed to belong to the Church of England, and to the priests of that church they were instructed to go for the sacraments. The preaching in the chapels and the other meetings of the societies were supposed to be appointed for hours which did not conflict with the morning and evening services of the church. With the exception of the few who were clergymen of the Church of England, the preachers who worked with Mr. Wesley in England were, as we have seen, unordained, and this was also true of the preachers in America prior to 1784. To have suggested in Asbury's time in England that the United Societies would one day proclaim themselves an independent church, and that the preachers would at last accept ordination from other hands than those of an Anglican bishop, would have created alarm among even the Methodists themselves. By what stretch of his fancy, then, could Asbury have foreseen himself a Methodist bishop? It is interesting to note the steps by which Wesley was led first to countenance and then to permit lay preaching in his societies, and at last to work it into his system as one of its cardinal features. The conversion of Wesley did not at first greatly modify his obstinate high church views, but the wisdom nourished by the experience growing out of it did, so that before the end of his life, he was completely delivered from hierarchical prejudices. Well, then he established his own hierarchy. But conservatism isn't the first generation, is it? He began his itinerant work in 1739 in connection with his brother Charles and George Whitfield. In an incredibly short time, the societies had grown beyond the ability of these three to supply their needs. The only visible means of providing the multiplying converts with spiritual bread was in committing to the revival of the evangelical ministers of the establishment. The number of these was limited, and even of that number, only a few were free to go. The situation raised a question which could be answered only from an inscrutable source. Yeah, means have to be made not only to maintain the organization as is, to uplift the spiritual community, but to invite people into the spiritual community. About this time, a layman violated all precedents and greatly shocked the sensibilities of both the Wesleys by delivering on his own motion a public exhortation immediately following one of the Whitfield's fervid discourses in the open. Soon after this, that is to say, about the end of 1739, Thomas Maxfield, one of Mr. Wesley's young converts, offered himself to serve as a son in the gospel, and to go and do as Wesley should direct. This offer was accepted not without misgivings, the churchman yielding an evangelical inch to the new and clamorous necessity. Yeah, social structures are secondary. Maxfield was given a general leave to exhort, but under no conditions to preach. In Islam, anybody who knows a verse can convey a verse. So as long as you speak on your knowledge and back things up, it doesn't matter whose authority you're linked to or not. Soon after, to continue the story, in Wesley's own words, came another, Thomas Richards, then a third, Thomas Westall. It will be noticed that these all bore the name of Thomas, reversing the history of that disciple who doubted. Whatever indeed of doubt there was at the opening of this dispensation of lay evangelism was on the part of a man whose name was John. Wesley did doubt, and, as the final outcome proved, concerning the steps which carried him farthest toward the success of his mission. Again, the inevitable happened. Returning to London from one of his tours through the interior, Wesley learned that Thomas Maxfield had been preaching. The high churchman in him was doubly scandalized, and he meditated putting an end to the possibility of a recurrence of the offense by similarly dismissing the offender. Three things, however, caused him to pause and, at last, reconsider his purpose. First, his mother's caution in young Maxfield's favor. Second, the fruit of Maxfield's preaching, for men and women have been converted under it. And third, his own unanswerable logic, namely that those who are only called of God and not of man have more right to preach than those who are only called of man and not of God. It is the Lord, he said at last, let him do what seemeth good. But if Wesley needed a further argument to complete his conviction, it was supplied in the cause of John Nelson, the Yorkshire stonemason, who had, as a high spirit and as brave a heart as ever Englishman was blessed with, and whose story is one of recorded miracles of Methodism. An early convert of Wesley's preaching in London, where he worked at his trade, he journeyed back to his native shire to tell his kinsmen and neighbors what great things had been done for him of heaven. The simple people desired him to continue the story from day to day. This he did, and the multitudes flocked to his door, where he sat to talk, and all before he or his audience suspected it. He also was preaching. Alarmed at what had happened, he sent for Wesley. The great leader came without delay, sat at the stonemason's fireside, saw the throngs that crowded about his door, and heard the message which he delivered. The evidence that a new dispensation had dawned was overwhelming, and the question of lay preaching in Methodism was settled for all time. At the death of Wesley in 1731, 300 lay preachers were attached to his conferences in Great Britain, serving 76,000 members in society. Asbury's conversion was his call to be an evangelist. His first answer was to assemble his youthful companions and exhort them to repentance. This was followed by the more public step of holding meetings in the homes of his father's neighbors. These meetings appear to have been begun entirely on his own initiative. There was no Methodist preaching or oversight of any kind in the parish, or perhaps in all that part of Staffordshire. But it has been this spontaneity of Methodism that has made it effective throughout its era. The flying spark has engendered a flame, but the zeal of the youthful evangelist was soon to be put to test. Persecutions of a serious nature arose. As early as 1743, somewhat less than 2 years before Asbury's birth, Wesley himself had been subjected to much persecution in Staffordshire at Wesleyan, being attacked by a mob and narrowly escaping death. For a year or more, a condition of terror obtained amongst the Methodists in that region. Periodically, this persecuting spirit revived, and now, after 17 years, it overflowed about the feet of the latest convert, a saddler's apprentice in Handsworth parish. The householders under whose roofs the youthful exhorter had been permitted to gather, his rustic audiences became alarmed, and withdrew their hospitality. Not discomfited, he began exhorting in his father's house, and continued to do so for a considerable time. Meanwhile, he was also meeting a class at Bromwich Heath, and attended each week a band meeting at Wesleyan, where he had formed his first connection with the Methodists. The extent of his home labors were, however, not known at either of these places, where he was treated as a catechumen or probationer. But he was even then practicing the rule which made him so great and masterful in all his work in the New World. As fast as he received, he gave out. What was imparted to him of grace and instructions at Bromwich Heath and Wesleyan, he quickly carried to his little Hearthstone audiences in the cottage home near the foot of Hampstead Bridge. When, therefore, he appeared as a licensed exhorter in the Methodist meeting houses at Wesleyan and elsewhere, the surprise of the people was great, they not knowing how he had been learning and exercising and a prophet's school of his own. It must be borne in mind that all this occurred about the beginning of the 17th year. It is seldom that this record has been paralleled outside of the Methodist itinerancy. One thing that happens among the Islamic world is that people get license of understanding. You get a license in fiqh. And, well, you are learning other people's understanding. It's not necessarily that you have the understanding yourself, but passing on the traditional interpretations, that certainly has value. And some people can't see to direct following purely. So some of that knowledge is important to show precedence, at least. When somewhere between the 17th and 18th year, Asbury was licensed as a local preacher, and although still pursuing his calling as a saddler's apprentice, he began to serve as a volunteer helper on circuits in his own and adjoining shires. For the space of about 5 years, he continued in this relation, and thus finished the term of his apprenticeship. He had now reached his majority and was free to make his choice for life. Like the Galilean fisherman, he gave up all to follow in the footsteps of his Lord, or at least what he was told, or such. He left the saddler's bench to become an itinerant in Mr. Wesley's conference. It is impossible to determine in what circuits, and indeed under what conditions, the saddler preacher worked during the 5 years previous to his entrance into the traveling connection. He enumerates circuits in Derbyshire, Staffordshire, Warwickshire, and Worcestershire as having been visited by him, but nothing is said of the time spent upon either are of the details of any labors bestowed upon them. But though these were neighboring shires, to accomplish the visitations named and to preach, as he records, he oftentimes did 3, 4, and even 5 times a week, and attend to his trade was in itself an apostolic labor. In 1768, he served his first itinerant year as helper on a circuit or circuits in Staffordshire and Gloucestershire. The next year, 1769, he travelled in the same capacity in Bedfordshire, Sussex, and other parts. In the latter end of 1769, thus being the beginning of his 3rd year in the traveling connection, he was appointed assistant. That is, he was put in charge of a circuit in Northamptonshire. The next year he travelled in Wiltshire, but whether as helper or as assistant, the record does not show. The close of this itinerant year came with the conference, which met at Bristol in August of 1771, a memorable date in the life of Asbury, and also in the history of American Methodism. Asbury was just then completing his 26th year. For more than 6 months previous to the meeting of this conference, he had been visited by strong intimidations that he should offer himself for service in America. With what self-abandonment he did this, and how he was accepted for that far-off field, will be told in another chapter. No estimate can be formed of the character of Asbury's preaching during his itinerant service in England. His journal gives the texts and often the outlines of more than 100 sermons preached during his ministry of 45 years in America, but not a scrap of any one of his sermons preached in his England circuits has been preserved. That they were crude at first, but often effective, we have reason to believe. Cautiously, and with that reserve with which he had sketched the events of his early life, he mentions several cases of awakening and conversions which followed his preaching. What, however, may be safely assumed concerning this early preaching is that it was typical of the prevalent Methodist exhortation. Asbury was thoroughly Wesleyan, and no man connected with Wesley ever more completely imbibed his spirit, not in servile imitation of the great leader, but in a careful use of his example. He worked out a regimen of habits and industry that in some points of excellence and practicability went even beyond his model. The foundation of Asbury's success and greatness as a preacher were laid in England. During the 10 years of his mixed ministry, there he had mastered the whole system of Wesleyan Arminianism, and had made himself acquainted to a greater or less extent with other theological schools. The great doctrine he had explored from the viewpoint of the naked words of the evangelists and the Pauline epistles, and his faith was grounded in them beyond uprooting or change. It is certain, too, that he had read and studied much sermonic literature, and what was still better, he had heard, not occasionally, but often, many of the very greatest of England's evangelical preachers, contemporaneous with Wesley. And here abides a secret. Those who have heard with appreciation and understanding the words and precepts of the great can themselves never be less than great in their own measure. That Asbury, during his itinerant service in England, was in special favor with Wesley seems certain, but not even Wesley could have dreamed that in his youthful helper was wrapped up the evangelization of a continent and the religious leadership of the New World. It was Providence, wonderful Providence, that found Staffordshire Sadler and gave him this commission. Well, working with fated circumstance is not the same thing as what is done with circumstance being predestined, except in that sense that it was chosen and it was allowed, and perhaps it was known beforehand, but let's not be fatalists. I mean, that wasn't as related as I thought when it first started coming out.